Hi guys, welcome to the Quiet Past historical channel. Tonight you're stepping into a world that no longer exists, a world lit entirely by fire, where the greatest city on earth fell silent sometime after midnight, and in the dark heart of that silence, in marble rooms you will never walk through, the most powerful men who ever lived lay awake and listened to the night. You are going to spend the next few hours drifting through those rooms, through the bedchambers and the bathing halls, through the candlelit corridors and the garden paths where emperors walked barefoot in the dark. You are going to learn what they ate before sleep, what they feared when the lamps went low, how they prepared their bodies and their minds for the long hours of Roman darkness. This is not a story about battles or betrayals, though those things exist in the background, the way thunder exists somewhere far off on an otherwise quiet evening. Tonight is about something smaller than that, something more intimate. Tonight is about the rituals, the ones nobody writes about, the ones hidden in the footnotes of ancient texts, pressed between the pages of medical treatises and philosophical letters and the private memoirs of men who ruled the known world and still could not always sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night begin. Before we go any further, if you find yourself enjoying this kind of slow, detailed journey through ancient history, the kind that takes its time and lets you breathe, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more nights like this one waiting for you. New episodes appear regularly, each one an invitation to step away from the noise and spend a few quiet hours somewhere else in history entirely. And now, back to Rome. The city after dark Rome at night was nothing like Rome during the day. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because when we think of ancient Rome we tend to picture it in full daylight. The forum crowded with people, merchants shouting prices, senators in white togas moving through columns of marble, the air smelling of bread and smoke and animals. Rome in motion. Rome in its full, overwhelming, slightly nauseating vitality. But that Rome, the daytime Rome, shut down sometime in the late afternoon. The law required it, actually. Julius Caesar, long before he became the kind of historical figure whose name appears on salad dressings and calendar reforms, enacted rules that prohibited wheeled vehicles from moving through the city streets during daylight hours. The logic was practical. Rome was too crowded, too dense, too narrow in its alleys, and crossings for carts and wagons to safely navigate, while thousands of people were trying to use the same streets at the same time. So the carts came at night instead. This meant that as the sun dropped toward the hills west of the city, as the shadows stretched long and purple across the white stone of the forum, as the vendors began packing away their wares and the public spaces emptied, Rome began to fill with a different kind of sound entirely. The groan of wooden axles, the slow, heavy thud of ox hooves on paving stone, the creak and rattle of laden carts making their way through streets that were, for the first time in 12 hours, wide enough to accommodate them. The shouts of drivers negotiating narrow corners, the sound of barrels rolling, of amphorae shifting against each other in their straw packing, and beneath all of that, the sound of the city resettling itself. The poor who lived in the upper floors of the great apartment blocks called insulae had spent the day descending and ascending those stairs. Now they came home in the dark. The wealthy who lived in ground floor houses called domus had sent their slaves out for final errands. Now the slaves returned. The night soil collectors began their rounds. The bakers, whose ovens would need to run all night if there was to be bread in the morning, stoked their fires and began work in the glow of oil lamps that painted their walls amber and threw their shadows large and shifting against the ceiling. Rome at night was loud in a completely different register than Rome in the daytime. And it was into this city, noisy, dark, fragrant with things you would rather not identify, patrolled by the vigils who served as both firefighters and night watchmen, that we begin our story. Because the emperors of Rome did not live apart from this city. They were embedded in it. Their palaces rose from its hills. Their walls backed up against the ordinary walls of ordinary buildings. On certain nights, if the wind was right, they could hear the carts. And they, like everyone else in Rome, had to find a way to sleep through it. The Palatine Hill. This is where we are going. This is the address, if you want to think of it that way. The Palatine Hill, which rises from the center of Rome in a long, irregular saddle shape, overlooking the Forum to the north and the Circus Maximus to the south. This is the hill from which the word palace itself derives, through a chain of language so long and winding that it almost seems impossible. Palatine becomes Palladium again in medieval, Latin becomes Palais in Old French becomes palace in English. A hill becomes a word. By the time of the early emperors, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, the Palatine had already been prime real estate for centuries. The old Roman families had their great houses there. It was in every sense the best address in the city, and Augustus, the first emperor, a man who understood the power of symbolism better than almost anyone who has ever lived, made it his home while being very careful to make it look like he was not doing anything as vulgar as claiming the best real estate in the city for himself. He lived modestly, by the standards of later emperors. His house was not vast. His bedroom, famously, was small and plain, a narrow room that a modern person would probably classify as a storage closet. He slept on a bed that visitors described as ordinary. He wore plain wool. he ate simple food, but he lived on the Palatine, and after him, every emperor did. Over the generations, the hilltop was progressively consumed by imperial construction. The Flavian emperors built the massive Domus Flavia and Domus Augustana in the 80s and 90s CE, a complex so large and so thoroughly covering the hilltop that it essentially created a new artificial plateau. Later emperors added to this. Septimius Severus, in the late 100s and early 200s CE, added an extension that cantilevered out over the southern slope of the hill on a platform of arch substructures so enormous they look, even now as ruins, like the foundations of something that should not have been possible to build. The view from the imperial bedchamber, depending on which emperor we are talking about, depending on which century, depending on which particular room, might look north over the Forum and the crowded hills beyond it, or south toward the long spine of the Circus Maximus with its obelisks and turning posts, or west toward the river and the bridges, or east toward the distant hills of the Alban countryside where the air was cooler and the night sounds were gentler. But all of those views would have been lit at night, the way everything was lit at night in the ancient world, by fire. Let us spend a moment with the light, because light matters enormously to this story. The Romans had, broadly speaking, three sources of artificial light. Torches, which were more or less what you imagine, a combustible material, pitch-soaked wool typically, or bundles of resinous wood, attached to a stick or set into an iron bracket on a wall. Oil lamps, which were small ceramic or bronze vessels with a wick running from a reservoir of oil, usually olive oil, which was both the most available and the most pleasant-smelling fuel available. And candles, which were less common than we might imagine. Tallow candles existed but were smoky and unpleasant, and beeswax candles were expensive enough that they were considered luxuries. The light produced by all of these sources was warm, amber orange, and in constant motion. There is no such thing as a steady ancient light. Every lamp, every torch, every candle produced a flame that moved with the air. In a room with open windows, the light pulsed and swayed. In a closed room, it still trembled with its own internal rhythms, the subtle convection currents that any fire creates around itself. This means that every room in the ancient world, every night, was full of moving shadows. The shadows of furniture grew and shrank. The shadows of people stretched across walls and ceilings in elongated, soft-edged forms that did not stay still. The light itself created a kind of constant, gentle motion in rooms that were otherwise perfectly quiet. We have essentially no experience of this kind of lighting in the modern world. The closest approximation is perhaps a room lit entirely by candles, or a campfire in the dark. But even then, we know that if we want, we can turn on a switch and the world will flood with steady, unwavering electric light. The Romans had no such backstop. From sunset to sunrise, every source of light was alive in this way, warm and moving and finite. The imperial palaces were, of course, better lit than ordinary homes. Emperors could afford more lamps, better oil, more attendants whose job it was to trim wicks and replenish fuel and make sure the corridors were not wholly dark. Archaeological evidence from the Palatine suggests that major rooms and corridors in the palace complex would have had multiple lampstands, placed at intervals, creating pools of overlapping amber light that made the space navigable and, in the well-appointed reception rooms, genuinely beautiful. But the private rooms, the bedchambers, the small studies, the personal bathing rooms would have been lit by fewer lamps. Intimate, moving, amber dim. This is the light in which the emperors conducted their midnight rituals, warm and shifting and alive. Before we go inside the bedchamber, we should understand something about the Roman attitude toward night itself. The Romans divided the night into 4 watches, the vigilia, each approximately 3 hours long, depending on the time of year and the actual length of the night. The first watch ran from sunset to roughly 9 at night, the second from 9 to midnight, the third from midnight to 3 in the morning, the fourth from 3 until dawn. Each watch had its own character, its own associations, its own set of appropriate activities and concerns. The first watch was for winding down, for dinner, conversation, bathing, the gradual transition from the business of the day to the quiet of the night. The second watch was for sleep, proper sleep, the deep early portion of the night's rest when the body and the mind descended most fully into unconsciousness. But here is something interesting. Something that scholars of sleep history have found when they go looking through ancient texts for evidence of how pre-industrial people actually slept. They did not sleep the way we sleep. The modern assumption is that healthy sleep is a single, unbroken block of 7 or 8 hours. You lie down, you close your eyes, and roughly 8 hours later you wake up. Any deviation from this pattern, waking in the middle of the night, lying awake for an hour, falling back to sleep, is considered in the modern world to be a symptom of insomnia, a disorder, something to be treated. But the historical evidence suggests that this was not how humans slept for most of recorded history. The historian Roger Eckertz, who spent decades researching pre-industrial sleep, found in his examination of court records, diaries, medical texts, and literary sources across multiple cultures and centuries, that the standard pattern of sleep before the widespread adoption of artificial lighting was not 1 block but 2. People went to sleep at dark or shortly after. They slept for roughly 4 hours. Then they woke up naturally sometime around midnight. They were awake for 1 to 2 hours. Then they slept again until dawn. This pattern was so universal that it had names. In English, people called the first period first sleep and the second period second sleep. The French called the first period premier sommeil. Medical writers recommended it as the natural and healthy pattern. People planned around it. They used the waking interval between the 2 sleeps to pray, to have quiet conversations with their partners, to think, to attend to bodily needs, to engage in the kind of low-intensity activity that was uniquely possible in the deepest part of the night. The Romans had their own version of this understanding. The third watch, midnight to 3 in the morning, was not considered in Roman thinking, a time when all healthy people should be unconscious. It was considered a liminal time, a boundary time, a time that belonged to a specific set of activities and concerns. The gods who presided over the third watch were the gods of transition and boundary. Janus, whose 2 faces looked simultaneously forward and backward in time. Hecate, the goddess of crossroads who belonged to neither day nor night but to the space between them. Vigilia Tertia, the third watch. This is the time we are most interested in. This is when the midnight rituals happened. Augustus and the art of restless sleep. We begin with Augustus, because in so many ways, everything begins with Augustus. Gaius Octavius Thurinus, who became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, who became Augustus, the revered one who became the template against which every subsequent Roman emperor would be measured, whether they knew it or not. He ruled for 41 years, from 27 BCE to 14 CE, longer than any emperor who followed him. He transformed Rome from a republic into something that called itself a republic but functioned as a monarchy, and he did it so gradually, so carefully, so incrementally, that many people who lived through the transformation did not fully notice it happening. He was not a large man. Contemporary sources describe him as short, perhaps 5 feet 7 inches, which was average for a Roman man, but modest enough that he wore built-up shoes on formal occasions to add to his height. He was fair-complexioned, with light hair that he wore combed forward over what was, apparently, a receding hairline he was somewhat sensitive about. He had clear, bright eyes, bright enough that, his biographer Suetonius tells us, he liked to think that when he looked at someone directly, his gaze had a kind of physical power, like sunlight. He was, for most of his life, in uncertain health. He suffered from a long list of ailments that reads, 2,000 years later, like the complaints of a man whose body was constantly at war with itself. Liver problems, bladder stones, seasonal fevers that came every spring and fall with the reliability of tax collection, a persistent weakness in his left hip and leg that made him limp, problems with his fingers in cold weather, and a sensitivity to both heat and cold that made dressing a complicated daily negotiation between the weather and his own fragile comfort. And he could not sleep. This is documented not as gossip or literary embellishment, but as a medical fact recorded by his own physician and repeated by Suetonius, who had access to Augustus's own written account of his health, a document the emperor himself composed, apparently quite candidly, and left to posterity. Augustus suffered from chronic insomnia. Not occasional insomnia, the kind that visits everyone at certain points in life, but the persistent, structural kind that becomes part of the architecture of a person's existence, a condition that reshapes the entire day around the question of sleep. His midnight rituals, as a result, were shaped by necessity as much as by preference. The bedroom of Augustus on the Palatine Hill was, by his own instruction and confirmed by later descriptions, small and plain. The walls were not elaborately frescoed in the style fashionable among wealthy Romans of his era. The floor was simple. The bed was narrow and covered with ordinary woolen blankets rather than the silk coverlets that his status would easily have permitted. This simplicity was partly genuine and partly calculated. Augustus was engaged, throughout his reign, in an elaborate public performance of traditional Roman virtue. The frugality, the plainness, the wool rather than silk, these were statements. They said, "I am not a king. I am not pursuing luxury for its own sake. I am a servant of Rome who happens to occupy the most powerful position in Rome, and I live accordingly." But there is also evidence that the simplicity of his private rooms was genuinely comfortable to him. He was a man who found large, elaborate spaces unsettling rather than reassuring. His preferred summer retreat was a small room in his house that he called his Syracuse, a name borrowed from the Sicilian city, though the connection is unclear, where he could withdraw completely from the demands of the court, bolt the door, and simply be alone for a few hours. Being alone for Augustus was not a luxury, it was a medical requirement. On the nights when sleep would not come, and those nights were many, Augustus had a set of practices that he fell back on. He read. This was, for a man of his education and disposition, the most natural of all nighttime activities. He was genuinely interested in literature, history, and philosophy. He wrote himself poetry, a tragedy called Ajax, which he eventually abandoned, and when asked about its progress, responded with self-deprecating humor that his Ajax had fallen on his sponge, a reference to the way a writer wipes out mistakes on a wax tablet, and an autobiography that covered his life up to the Cantabrian Wars and that we no longer have. The loss of that autobiography is, if you think about it for a moment, one of the great small tragedies of historical survival. Augustus writing his own story in his own voice, lying awake in that small room on the Palatine with a lamp burning beside him. What did he read in the middle of the night? Suetonius says that his reading had a practical orientation even in leisure. He was interested in history and moral philosophy. He read works that he could extract useful maxims from, sentences that could be detached from their context and applied to the problems of ruling an empire. He kept commonplace books, which were personal notebooks in which educated Romans collected quotations, observations, and reflections for later use. The commonplace book was a technology of the mind, a memory aid and a thinking tool, and Augustus's were apparently extensive. He also wrote letters. This was, in the ancient world, the primary medium for extended personal communication, and Augustus was a prolific correspondent. His letters were famous in antiquity. Suetonius quotes from them at length, and they reveal a man who was, in his private correspondence, much warmer and more playful than the formal, somewhat stiff persona he presented in public. He wrote to friends with jokes. He wrote to his grandsons with affection that is unmistakably genuine. He wrote to Livia, his wife, with a tenderness that cuts across 2,000 years without any dilution at all. On sleepless nights, then, the lamp burning, the small room quiet around him, the city making its nighttime sounds in the distance, Augustus writing letters by hand on wax tablets or sheets of papyrus, to people who would read those words days or weeks later, in other rooms, in other cities. There is one particular habit of Augustus's that sleep historians find especially interesting. He kept a kind of schedule that modern sleep researchers would recognize, with considerable surprise, as being genuinely sound by contemporary standards. He went to bed early by Roman standards, not immediately after sunset, which would have been considered eccentric, but shortly after dinner, which was typically consumed in the late afternoon, so perhaps an hour or two after sunset at most. He tried, when affairs of state permitted, to be horizontal and quiet by the end of the first watch. He did not always sleep immediately. Often he lay awake for some time, and this lying awake time was not, in the Roman understanding, wasted or pathological. It was simply the transition period between wakefulness and sleep, and Augustus used it for quiet mental activity, reviewing the day, composing plans, sometimes dictating to a secretary who sat by his bed for exactly this purpose, taking down whatever the emperor wished to say into the darkness. When he finally slept, he slept in the segmented way characteristic of the pre-industrial pattern. A period of deep sleep in the early part of the night, a natural waking sometime in the third watch, an interval of light activity, reading, writing letters, sometimes eating a small amount of food, and then a return to sleep for the second portion of the night, which often ran past dawn. He was not, he declared himself, a man who could manage well on less than 7 hours of total sleep, and this total was not achieved in one block. It was assembled across the night in pieces, with the waking interval in the middle being not a failure of sleep, but simply part of the pattern. He napped, this is documented clearly. After lunch, a short nap of perhaps an hour. In his later years, this afternoon rest became increasingly important as his overall nighttime sleep became more difficult to achieve. He napped lying down, not sitting in a chair the way less serious nappers might manage, but fully horizontal in a proper bedroom posture, with the household instructed to maintain quiet for the duration. The nap completed, he would return to whatever the afternoon required of him, reportedly alert and ready in a way that he was not if he skipped the rest. His secretaries learned to work around the nap. His appointments were scheduled to accommodate it. The empire, for an hour each afternoon, waited while Augustus slept. There is a passage in Suetonius, and Suetonius is someone we will return to many times tonight, because his Lives of the 12 Caesars is, among other things, the most detailed account we have of the private habits of Rome's early emperors, in which he describes Augustus's response to difficulty falling asleep. When the ordinary methods failed, when lying still and letting the mind grow quiet proved impossible, Augustus had recourse to what Suetonius describes as storytelling. He would summon a reader, or sometimes a literate slave whose voice he found pleasant, and have them read aloud to him. Not exciting literature, not dramatic history with its battles and speeches and moments of high emotion. Calm, regular, monotonous material, dry historical chronicles, geographical surveys. Documents of an administrative nature that he would normally have dealt with during the day, but whose careful, deliberate language made for excellent sleep-inducing reading when delivered in a low, steady voice in a lamp-lit room at the third watch. The reader would sit nearby, not in the room, apparently, or at least not in the bed's immediate vicinity, but close enough that the voice carried clearly, and read in this measured, unhurried tone until Augustus's breathing changed and the emperor was finally, gratefully asleep. at which point the reader would stop and sit in the dark and wait to see if they were needed again. The other element of Augustus's midnight life that deserves attention is the physical environment he maintained his sleep in. Romans of his class and period understood certain things about the relationship between the body and sleep that we would recognize today as entirely correct, and other things that we might find puzzling or even counterproductive. They understood that darkness was important. Roman bedrooms, cubicula, were typically small rooms designed to be sealed against light. The windows were small and could be shuttered. Augustus's cubiculum on the Palatine, by his own preference, had additional coverings, heavy curtains or blinds, that he used to block even the faint ambient light that filtered through shuttered windows. He wanted true darkness for sleep, or as close to it as lamps and curtains could achieve. He understood that temperature mattered. He was, as we noted, peculiarly sensitive to cold. His sleeping arrangements in winter involved multiple layers of clothing as well as bedding. Suetonius specifies a thick toga, worn as a kind of robe, plus an undershirt, and sometimes leg wrappings similar to what a soldier might wear for winter campaigns. He slept in a room that was warm enough, with a brazier, a portable metal container for burning charcoal, positioned to provide ambient heat without smoke or direct fire risk. In summer, his arrangements reversed. He sought cool rooms that faced north or were sheltered from the afternoon sun, rooms that could be opened to moving air at night while remaining protected from the heat of the day. His beloved Syracuse retreat appears to have been partly useful to him for exactly this reason. Its position in the house allowed for better ventilation than the main sleeping chamber. He was attentive to sound. The nighttime sounds of Rome, the carts, the night soil collectors, the occasional brawl in an alley, the dogs, these were not fully excludable, but Augustus's Palatine location put him above the worst of the street noise. What reached him was attenuated, distant. When even that was too much, when the third watch seemed particularly noisy for whatever reason, he slept with something similar to what we might call white noise. A water feature, probably a small fountain of the kind that wealthy Romans maintained in their interior courtyards, whose constant, steady sound provided a layer of acoustic cover against the intermittent noises of the city. Augustus died at 76 in 14 CE in the town of Nola in Campania, on a journey that his health had made increasingly difficult. He died, by all accounts, peacefully, in the arms of his wife Livia after asking his friends whether he thought he had played the comedy of life with sufficient skill. The comedy, he concluded, had been played tolerably well. He asked for a mirror. He had his hair combed. And then he died. It was late in the afternoon. The light on that August day in southern Italy would have been the long, golden late summer light of the Italian afternoon. Not midnight, not the third watch, but in a life so thoroughly shaped by its own nighttime rhythms, the small room, the lamp, the reader's voice, the segmented sleep assembled across the long Roman darkness, it seems almost appropriate that the man went quietly in a good light with his affairs in order after a life spent learning, with imperfect success, the art of sleeping. Tiberius and the Palazzo of Capri. After Augustus came Tiberius. If Augustus was the architect of the empire, the patient, calculating man who built the structure and made it seem inevitable, then Tiberius was the man who had to live in it, had to maintain it, had to be, for 23 years, the emperor when what he might have genuinely preferred was to be something quieter and less visible entirely. He was a Claudian by birth and a Julian by adoption, which meant he came from the oldest families of Rome with all the weight of ancestral expectation that implies. He was a competent general. He was a careful administrator. He was, in certain ways, genuinely conservative and principled in the old Roman sense, a man who believed in discipline, in the law, in the traditional forms. He was also, by virtually all contemporary accounts, deeply unhappy for most of his adult life. The relationship with Augustus was the central complication of his existence. He was Augustus's stepson, his military subordinate, and eventually, after the deaths of Augustus's more beloved heirs, his grandsons Gaius and Lucius, his reluctant successor. Tiberius knew, and everyone around him knew, that he was not the Emperor Augustus had wanted. He was the Emperor Augustus had left. This knowledge lived in him throughout his reign. It showed in his manner, which contemporaries described as gloomy, suspicious, and indirect. He was a man who disliked flattery and distrusted compliments, which made him peculiarly unsuited to a role that required the constant performance of being pleased by people who needed things from him. He preferred blunt speech and plain dealing, and got very little of either in the imperial court. And then in 26 CA, after 14 years of being emperor in Rome, Tiberius left. He left the city. He sailed south and east to the island of Capri, a small, steep, beautiful island in the Bay of Naples, with limestone cliffs dropping directly to the sea and a hilltop where you could see in every direction. And he never came back to Rome. He governed the empire for the last 11 years of his reign from that island. through letters and messengers, through his ministers on the mainland, through the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the powerful and eventually sinister Sejanus, and through a network of informants and secretaries who kept the machinery of the empire running while their emperor sat on his cliff and looked at the sea. History has not been kind to the Capri years. Suetonius, in particular, fills his account of Tiberius's retirement on the island with a catalogue of alleged depravities that reads less like historical evidence and more like the collected nightmares of someone who really disliked Tiberius. Whether these accounts have any basis in reality, or whether they are the literary revenge of a hostile tradition, is a question scholars have argued about for centuries. What we are interested in tonight is different. We are interested in the island, the physical place. The life of a man who chose a cliff over a city, and what that choice meant for the hours of his darkness. Capri rises steeply from the water. The island is essentially a pair of limestone massifs connected by a low saddle, surrounded on all sides by cliffs that range from manageable to frankly vertical. The highest point is Monte Solaro, which reaches something over 600 meters above sea level. Views from any elevated point on the island are extraordinary in every direction. The Bay of Naples to the north, with Vesuvius sitting on the horizon in a quiet menace that the Romans of that period had no reason to find ominous. The open Tyrrhenian Sea to the south and west, the peninsula of Sorrentum to the east. Tiberius built, or expanded, 12 villas on the island, one for each of the major Olympian gods according to one ancient source, though this may be poetic rather than literally true. The primary residence was the Villa Jarvis, the villa of Jupiter, perched at the far eastern end of the island on a plateau of rock some 330 meters above the sea. It is a ruin now, but an evocative one. You can still trace the outline of the rooms, the corridors, the cisterns that collected rainwater for the residents, the lighthouse platform on the eastern cliff edge. From the Villa Jarvis, on a clear day, you could see the coastline of the Italian mainland. You could see the ships moving through the channel. You could see, if the visibility was very good, the long shape of the Bay of Naples and the hills behind it. At night, you could see the lights. Not many lights, not the blazing continuous illumination we associate with modern coastal settlements. But scattered points of fire, the lights of fishing boats moving across the dark water, the occasional gleam from a lighthouse, the diffuse glow of Naples itself, the villages along the coast each represented by a cluster of warm points against the darkness of the hills. Tiberius, in his private rooms in the Villa Jarvis, looking east through a window in the third watch, would have seen exactly this. The sea, the lights, the dark shore. What do we know about Tiberius's own relationship with sleep and the night? Suetonius says that he was a light and troubled sleeper, a man who lay awake for long periods, who woke frequently, and who was troubled by dreams that, when he had occasion to describe them, tended toward the grim and the foreboding. He was afraid, according to these accounts, of thunder, which in a man who lived on an exposed limestone plateau above the sea is not an unreasonable fear. Lightning on the cliff edge of Capri, with the sea visible in all directions and no shelter for miles, would have been spectacular and genuinely alarming. He bathed at night. This is documented, and it matters. The Romans were, by the standards of the ancient world, enthusiastically committed to bathing. The public baths, thermae and balnea, were one of the great civic institutions of Rome, open to virtually everyone, used by virtually everyone, and visited typically in the afternoon, after the working day but before dinner. The private bathing facilities of wealthy homes and imperial palaces were more elaborate versions of the same thing. Warm rooms, heated pools, cold plunges, massage tables, oil and scraping tools called strigils, attendants whose entire professional existence was organized around the care of one person's body. For Tiberius on Capri, the bathing happened at whatever hour he chose, which sources suggest was often late, deep in the evening, sometimes in the second or even the third watch. The Villa Jarvis had bathing facilities, though on a more modest scale than the great imperial thermae of Rome. The water would have been heated, even in the Villa Jarvis, though how exactly this was managed on an island without abundant fresh water requires some thought. Capri's water situation was, in fact, a significant engineering challenge. The island has limited natural springs, and the Romans addressed this through the construction of large cisterns, capacious underground chambers lined with waterproof cement that collected rainfall and stored it against the dry months. The Villa Jarvis's cisterns are among the best preserved Roman cisterns in Italy, and they are impressive, deep, vaulted chambers that could hold many thousands of liters of water. But this water had to be managed carefully, which means that the elaborate plumbing of the great Roman baths was simplified somewhat on Capri, made practical for an island where water was precious. Tiberius bathed, then, in what was probably a more intimate environment than the great public or semi-public baths of Rome. A smaller pool, a room heated by the hypocaust system buried in the floors, the Roman underfloor heating technology that moved warm air through channels beneath the tiles, and attended by a small staff of personal servants who knew his preferences and his timing. After the bath, in that state of clean, warm physical ease that follows a long soak, What did he do? He walked, apparently. The loggia, the covered walkway of the Villa Jovis, ran along the southern edge of the plateau, and there is evidence that Tiberius used it for the kind of slow, meditative pacing that Romans associated with philosophical thinking. The peripatetic philosophers had established the intellectual respectability of walking while thinking, and the Romans had thoroughly internalized this. Thinking at rest, sitting still, hands folded, had its place, but for sustained mental work, for working through problems, for the kind of reflective activity that needs space and movement, walking was the appropriate form. On Capri, this walking happened against a backdrop that even a gloomy, suspicious, unhappy emperor must have found extraordinary. The cliff edge below the loggia dropped straight to the sea. The night air was salt and clean and cool. The stars over the Mediterranean are, away from any major light pollution, astonishing in their quantity and brightness. A full display of the Milky Way, the individual stars of the summer triangle blazing overhead, the slow rotation of the sky that the Romans watched for omens and navigation, and the simple pleasure of knowing that the world is larger than it appears from any one vantage point. Tiberius walked the loggia at night. The Emperor of Rome, alone or nearly alone with a silent attendant or two, walking slowly back and forth above the sea, thinking thoughts that nobody recorded, watching the sky turn. There is a Greek scholar named Thrasyllus whom Tiberius had lived with, traveled with, and clearly trusted for decades. Thrasyllus was an astrologer, a mathematician and interpreter of horoscopes, in an age when astrology was not distinguished from astronomy in the way it is today. He was a serious and learned man, and his relationship with Tiberius began in an anecdote that Tacitus tells with considerable dramatic skill. The story is this: when Tiberius was in exile on the island of Rhodes, a period before his return to Rome and his eventual accession as emperor, he had a habit of consulting astrologers on matters of personal destiny. He would bring these men to a high, isolated place and interview them, and then, having heard what they had to say, he would have them thrown off the cliff by a freedman who accompanied him for this purpose. The logic, chilling in its consistency, was that anyone who knew Tiberius's fate was a potential security risk, and removal was the most permanent form of security. When Thrasyllus was brought to the same isolated place and asked about Tiberius's destiny, he gave his answer about future imperial greatness with apparent confidence. Then he paused, looked at the sky, and said that he feared the present moment was critical and dangerous for himself. Tiberius, apparently impressed by this demonstration of astrological self-awareness, or perhaps simply by the man's nerve, spared his life. Thrasyllus became his closest intellectual companion for the rest of both their lives. Why does this matter for our story? Because Thrasyllus, or his son after him, was part of the intellectual environment of Tiberius's Capri existence. And the kind of thing they did together, reading the stars, discussing the movements of the planets, calculating the significance of this conjunction or that opposition, mapping the great grid of celestial influence onto the small human question of what would happen next, these were night activities. The stars are only visible at night. The great questions of destiny and fate that ancient astrology addressed were best contemplated in the dark, under the actual sky being discussed. Tiberius and his astrologer then, sitting together on the cliff edge above the sea, charts spread on a table, lamp flame held low against the wind, looking up at the sky and then down at the charts and then up at the sky again. Calculating, thinking, the empire somewhere behind them in the dark of the mainland, managed by proxies while the emperor studied the heavens. The island of Capri still exists, of course. Modern Capri is a tourist destination of some fame, beloved for its blue grotto and its expensive hotels and its views. But if you go to the eastern end of the island and climb to the ruins of the Villa Jovis, you will find a place that has not fundamentally changed in 2,000 years. The cliff is still there, the view is still there, the sea is still the sea. And at night, if you were to stand on that plateau in the dark, with the lights of the mainland just visible in the distance, and the stars overhead and the sound of the waves against the cliff far below, you would be standing in essentially the same sensory experience that Tiberius stood in. That is not a small thing. Most of the places where ancient history happened are buried under centuries of subsequent history. But the cliff edge of Capri at night in the dark, above the sea, that is largely unchanged. The same salt air, the same stars, the same sound. Caligula and the HOURS he could not fill, and as the night deepens, we move on to a more complicated subject. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, Caligula, whose name in Latin was simply a childhood nickname meaning little soldier's boot, given to him by the troops of his father's army who found the small boy charming and dressed him in a miniature military uniform. He was born in 12 CE, the third son of the beloved general Germanicus, and he grew up in military camps and on campaign as much as in Rome. He had what we might generously describe as an unstable childhood. His father died when he was 7, under circumstances that his mother Agrippina believed were the result of deliberate poisoning ordered by Tiberius. His mother was subsequently exiled and died in exile. His two older brothers were destroyed by political intrigue. He was, by his late teens, the last surviving male heir of his line. He was brought to Capri. He lived in Tiberius's household for 6 years, from 31 CE until the old emperor's death in 37 CE. He was 24 when he became emperor. The accounts of his reign begin positively and deteriorate with considerable speed. The first year is described by almost all sources as excellent. He was generous, popular, accessible, everything that the gloomy and remote Tiberius had not been. Then, according to the sources, something happened. There was a serious illness in the autumn of 37 CE, and when Caligula recovered, he was, by the consistent testimony of ancient writers, a different person. The transformation may have been many things. It may have been the psychological effect of nearly dying. It may have been the liberation from whatever constraints the illness imposed. It may have been the intoxication of absolute power in a young man without the character structure to handle it. Or it may be that the traditional ancient account is itself a kind of literary construct, a before and after narrative that historians found useful, and that individual writers each embellished according to their own purposes. What interests us tonight is the evidence, fragmentary but consistent across multiple sources, that Caligula, whatever else he was, could not sleep. Suetonius says it directly. Caligula never slept more than 3 hours at a stretch and was often tormented by visions that came to him in the dark. He lay awake for hours at a time, and when he did sleep, his dreams were disturbed. He wandered the palace at night. He sat at the edge of his bed in the dark and waited for dawn. This is described by Suetonius in the context of a catalogue of personal peculiarities that reads as diagnosis by a man who did not have the vocabulary for diagnosis. But if we separate the sleep description from the rhetorical frame around it, what emerges is a picture of a person experiencing something like severe, chronic insomnia, combined with what sounds like intrusive thoughts, and possibly nightmares significant enough to disrupt sleep for long periods. The palace at night in the early empire was a large and complex place. Caligula extended the Palatine complex significantly. He added a new wing that extended the imperial footprint toward the Forum, so that, as ancient sources put it with what seems like genuine outrage, he was essentially using the Temple of Castor and Pollux as a vestibule for his front entrance. Whether this was hubris, practicality, or simply an emperor who wanted more rooms is hard to say. But the physical complex he occupied was extensive. To wander it at night was to move through a succession of spaces that even in the third watch were populated. Slaves slept in corridors, in small side rooms and alcoves. Night guards patrolled. Certain staff were on duty continuously, and the machinery of a large household does not fully shut down even at 3 in the morning. So when Caligula wandered, he wandered through a world that was quiet but not empty. He moved through halls where sleeping forms were visible in corners and doorways, through courtyards where lamps burned at prescribed intervals, through gardens where the night plants, Nicotiana, moonflower, the white night blooming jasmine that the Romans grew in their private gardens, released their fragrance into the still air. What did he do when he could not sleep? The sources are both too detailed and not detailed enough. They give us fragments. He summoned performers. Actors, musicians, dancers, people whose presence transformed the nighttime rooms into something that felt less like being alone with one's own head. This was not in Roman culture, as eccentric as it might sound. Wealthy Romans regularly maintained domestic performers, educated slaves who could recite poetry, play instruments, perform scenes from plays. The entertainment infrastructure of a wealthy household was designed to be activatable at any hour, because the hours of the wealthy were not regular, and the wealthy expected their household to be responsive to whatever they wanted at whatever time. But Caligula went further, apparently, summoning performers from outside the household, from the broader entertainment world of Rome, professional actors and musicians who appear in the sources as being brought to the palace at unusual hours, whether they wished to be or not. One anecdote has him summoning a mime performer in the middle of the night, having the man perform for several hours, and then dismissing him before dawn with a reward that was generous enough to make the experience retroactively acceptable, if not exactly pleasant. He ate at night. This is worth noting because it runs contrary to one of the consistent recommendations of Roman medical writers, who agreed across the centuries that eating immediately before sleep was harmful to digestion and to the quality of sleep itself. But Caligula ate when he was awake, and since he was often awake at hours when eating was not medically advisable, he ate at those hours anyway. There is an implicit picture of midnight food in various sources. The kitchens of the palace activated in the deep hours of the night, producing whatever the emperor wanted, the staff working by lamplight, the smell of food moving through quiet corridors. He watched the stars. This is again documented in a context meant to suggest eccentricity or worse, but taken simply as an activity it is coherent. A man who could not sleep, going to a terrace or a rooftop, looking at the sky. The Palatine, being a hill, offered elevated vantage points. The sky over Rome in the ancient world was, in the near-total absence of electric light, a full and magnificent display. The same sky that Tiberius and his astrologer studied from the cliff of Capri was visible from the hilltop of Rome, perhaps slightly less dramatically framed but no less vast. He talked. This is perhaps the most humanizing detail in the catalogue of his nighttime habits. He talked. He sought company. He had favorites, men and women whose company he genuinely enjoyed, and when the night was long and sleep was not coming, he sent for them. This is described by hostile sources as tyranny, the summons in the night being presented as an imposition, a demonstration of power, but it is also, simply and recognizably, the behavior of a lonely insomniac who does not want to be alone in the dark at 3 in the morning. Caligula died at 28, assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard in January of 41 CE. He had been emperor for less than 4 years. The assassination happened in the middle of the afternoon, in a covered passageway beneath the Palatine, while he was watching games. The men who killed him did it in a corridor, surrounded by marble and shadow, with none of the grandeur that historical murder is supposed to have. He was 28 years old. He had spent a significant portion of his adult life awake in the dark. Whether the sleeplessness was a symptom of something, a cause of something, or simply the condition of his particular mind in his particular life, that is not a question we can answer with the evidence we have, but the sleeplessness is real. The nights were long for Caligula, and the company he kept in those long nights, and the routines he constructed to make the dark hours tolerable, those are as real and human as the rest of him, whatever we make of the rest of him. Claudius and the emperor who studied Claudius came to power at 50, by accident. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers responsible for the emperor's personal protection, and it turned out for the occasional decision about who the emperor was going to be, found him hiding behind a curtain in the palace after Caligula's assassination. They had just killed one emperor. They needed another. Here was a Julio Claudian, a member of the right family, hiding behind a curtain in the palace because he had nowhere else to go. They proclaimed him emperor. Presumably had complicated feelings about this. Claudius was, in the most literal sense of the word, a scholar. He had grown up in the household of Augustus and Livia as the family embarrassment, a man whose various physical difficulties, a limp, a stutter, involuntary movements of the head and hands, a tendency to drool under stress, an inability to project the physical authority that Roman aristocrats were supposed to embody, had led his own family to treat him as essentially invisible. He was excluded from public duties. He was not given the usual cursus honorum, the ladder of offices that a man of his rank was expected to climb. He was, in short, left alone, and he spent that aloneness reading. He read everything. He learned multiple languages. He wrote histories of the Etruscans, of the Carthaginians, of the early Roman kings, works that no longer survive but that ancient sources treat as serious scholarship, not the amateur dabbling of a man with too much time. He wrote a history of Rome from the death of Julius Caesar that his own mother apparently said was too candid and had to be substantially revised before it could be publicly circulated. He wrote an autobiography. He proposed reforms to the Latin alphabet, introducing 3 new letters that he thought would improve the language's phonetic representation, and that after his death were simply abandoned. He was a man for whom reading and writing were not recreation but vocation. The distinction between his scholarly self and his imperial self was, for Claudius, probably much thinner than it appeared from the outside. And what does this mean for the midnight hours? Claudius read at night. This is not surprising, given what we know about him, but it is documented specifically enough to be worth examining. He had a private library, which is not unusual for a wealthy Roman, but which in Claudius's case appears to have been genuinely extensive and seriously curated. Not the status display of a man who wanted to be seen as learned, but the working library of a man who actually needed certain volumes at hand because he was using them. The organization of his nighttime reading was, by ancient accounts, purposeful rather than recreational. He worked at night. He drafted text. He had scholars brought to him for extended discussions that sometimes ran well past the conventional evening hours into the night proper. There is a document from his reign, a letter he wrote to the citizens of Alexandria in Egypt, a document that survives in a papyrus copy and is therefore one of the more concrete textual records of imperial communication we have from this period, that is remarkable in its tone and detail. It addresses a series of civil disputes between the Jewish and Greek communities of Alexandria with the kind of specific, careful, clearly well-researched engagement that suggests not a document dashed off by a bureaucrat, but something its author had thought about at length, probably across multiple sessions, probably including some that happened at night. Claudius at night, then, was something like Claudius at any other time, thinking, reading, writing, working. The darkness gave him something that the daytime did not always provide, which was the absence of the demands and the embarrassments and the social performances of the waking world. At night, in the lamplight, with his books and his writing tools, he was simply a scholar. Whatever the guards outside the door and the empire outside the palace said about what he was, He had particular nighttime habits that his biographers find worth recording. He ate at night. This is documented not with the slightly scandalous tone used about Caligula, but with the affectionate exasperation that seems to have been the general emotional register of people who dealt with Claudius regularly. He ate often and substantially. He ate in bed, apparently, or at least in his private rooms, rather than at a formal dining table, which was deeply un-Roman in its informality, but very Claudian in its suggestion that food was fuel for the ongoing scholarly project, rather than a social event with its own rituals. He drank wine. This is documented also with that affectionate exasperation, the suggestion being that he drank more than was entirely advisable, and that the combination of wine and late-night scholarly activity sometimes resulted in work of uncertain quality. There is at least one ancient anecdote about him reading aloud from something he had apparently written in such a state, and having to stop because the laughter of his audience made it clear that the work required revision. He played dice. Gambling was a Roman pleasure that crossed all class lines, from the graffiti-covered walls of Pompeian taverns, where ordinary people scratched their game results into plaster, to the elaborate gaming tables of wealthy households, where fortunes changed hands over the throwing of dice, or the outcomes of board games. Claudius was known to be fond of the dice. He wrote a book about dice games. And he played at night, a low-stakes, intimate activity that provided just enough mental engagement to make the dark hours pass, without requiring the full intellectual concentration of his scholarly work. He loved this kind of contrast, apparently, the long, serious, concentrated reading and writing session, followed by a period of something lighter and more social. A few throws of the dice with whoever was around, a cup of wine, an exchange of the kind of mild gossip and easy conversation that flows naturally around a gaming table at midnight. His wife Messalina is traditionally present in his midnight world, in a form that ancient sources treat as scandalous and modern historians treat as at least partly literary invention. The traditional account has Claudius sleeping deeply and obliviously while his young wife conducted a social life that he was entirely unaware of. Whether this is literally true is a different question from whether it illuminates something about Claudius's nighttime reality, which is the obliviousness of a man deeply absorbed in his own inner life. His fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, who succeeded Messalina and whose political intelligence was, by all accounts, considerably more formidable, appears in his midnight world in a different key. She was, according to sources, an active participant in the governance of the empire, far more directly involved than Roman convention permitted for a woman, which was part of why later sources were so hostile to her. If Claudius was reading and writing at night, it seems entirely plausible that Agrippina was in the same rooms, reading her own documents, thinking her own thoughts, building her own strategies. But this is speculative territory. What we know is that Claudius, emperor of Rome for 13 years, spent a significant portion of his nights in the same mode as a significant portion of his days. Surrounded by books, working by lamplight, the world of scholarship that had been his refuge and his identity since childhood continuing uninterrupted into the dark hours. The philosophy of Roman darkness, meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, let us step back for a moment from the individual emperors and spend some time with the ideas they lived inside. Because the emperors of Rome did not invent their relationship with the night from scratch. They inherited it, along with everything else they inherited, from a culture that had been thinking about night, sleep, and darkness for a very long time. The Roman philosophical tradition, which was largely borrowed from the Greek tradition, adapted and Latinized but not fundamentally altered, had a great deal to say about sleep. The Epicureans, who prized tranquility above all else and considered the undisturbed mind the highest achievable condition, saw good sleep as a kind of proof of philosophical success. If you had managed your desires and your anxieties correctly, sleep would come naturally, and it would be deep and restful and free of the nightmares that pursued people who lived badly. To sleep well was to live well. The man lying awake with his heart hammering in the dark was, to the Epicurean mind, a man who had failed to properly understand what was worth wanting. The Stoics, who dominated the philosophical life of the late Republic and early Empire, took a more demanding view. Sleep was a necessity, the body required it, and a man who denied his body what it required was being needlessly cruel to something that, while secondary to the soul, still deserved basic maintenance. But sleep was also, to a Stoic, a form of voluntary unconsciousness, a time when the rational faculty, the hegemonikon, was offline, and the body was simply doing what bodies do. The Stoic was not supposed to dread the approach of this unconsciousness, or cling to it when it ended, or treat the waking interval in the middle of the night as a problem. It simply was what it was. Marcus Aurelius, who we will spend considerable time with later tonight, was a Stoic of considerable seriousness, and his Meditations, the private journal of a philosopher-emperor, contain passages that illuminate the Stoic attitude toward the night in ways that are both philosophically rigorous and deeply personal. But before Marcus, let us spend some time with the man who may be the most eloquent Roman writer on the subject of the night and the mind that cannot quiet itself: Lucius Annius Seneca. Seneca was not an emperor, though he spent a significant portion of his career as the tutor, then the advisor, then the political inconvenience of one. He was born in Corduba in Spain sometime around 4 BCE, came to Rome, made a career as an orator and writer, was exiled by Caligula, recalled by Claudius, became the most important figure in the early court of Nero, gradually lost influence, and eventually was forced to commit suicide in 65 CE when Nero, perhaps correctly, suspected him of involvement in a conspiracy. He was, in addition to all of this, a writer of extraordinary quality. His letters, the Epistulae Morales, the moral letters to Lucilius, are among the most readable pieces of Latin prose in existence, and they are full of the night. Seneca had insomnia. He says so directly, in the way that characterizes his whole epistolary project, with complete candor, using his own life as illustrative material for philosophical points, without the self-aggrandizement that makes some Roman autobiographical writing unreadable. He was sick often. He had chronic respiratory problems, probably tuberculosis, or whatever the Roman equivalent was, that were worse at night, and that made the nighttime a period of physical discomfort as well as mental restlessness. "I am doing this, trying to mend my ways late in life," he writes to Lucilius in one of the early letters. And the letters themselves are evidence of a nighttime practice. Many of them were clearly written in the late evening or the night, composed in the quiet that allowed for the kind of sustained self-examination their content required. He describes in letter 84 the practice of reading and writing as a complementary pair, a breathing in and breathing out of the mind. You read to take in the ideas of others. You write to express what those ideas have become once they have passed through you and been transformed by your own thinking. Reading without writing is, he says, like eating without digesting. And this is explicitly a nighttime practice for him. The lamp, the scroll, the wax tablet for notes, the gradual absorption and processing of whatever he has been working through. He also writes about what it is like to lie awake at night when the philosophical work is not going well. In letter 56, he describes living in a noisy apartment building, the Roman Insula, the multi-story apartment block that housed most of the city's population, where the sounds of the night are exhausting in their variety. The grunt and shout of someone exercising in the courtyard below, the slap of hands against bodies during massage, the cake seller calling his wares, the noise of someone being sick, the brawl that erupts at midnight in the alley. He refuses to be disturbed. He practices, with observable effort, the Stoic technique of removing oneself mentally from external disturbance through the application of reason. The noise does not stop. The effort to be unmoved by it is continuous. He achieves something not quite silence, but a quiet mind inside the noise, which is not the same thing but is, he argues, better than silence in some ways because it was achieved rather than simply received. This is the philosophical texture of Roman nights, the ongoing project of achieving equanimity in conditions that did not naturally support it. The Roman physician Galen, who wrote in the 2nd century CE and whose medical writings were canonical for over 1,000 years, has extensive passages on sleep, dreams, and the conditions that promote or disturb them. Galen believed that good sleep was a function of 4 things: the balance of the humors, the temperature of the body, the state of the digestive process, and the character of the soul. This last factor, the soul's character, is where the medical merges with the philosophical. A person of good character, who had nothing to fear and no unresolved conflicts, would sleep well. A person of troubled conscience or excessive passion would sleep badly, and no amount of dietary management or environmental optimization would fully compensate for the moral disorder. This meant that the emperor's sleep, reported on, discussed, speculated about, used as evidence for the quality of his reign in literary accounts, was not a private matter. It was a public indicator. The good emperor slept well because the good emperor's conscience was clear and his passions were governed. The bad emperor lay awake because he deserved to. This framework explains why so many of the hostile accounts of Roman emperors' sleep problems are structured the way they are. Suetonius, describing Caligula's nighttime wanderings, is not just reporting a biographical quirk. He is making a moral argument. The man could not sleep because the man was not good. The sleeplessness is evidence. Whether the evidence is valid is a different question from whether the framework is coherent, and the framework is, within its own terms, entirely coherent. There is one more element of the Roman philosophical relationship with darkness that we need to consider before we move on. The Romans believed in dreams as a form of communication. Not in a vague or superstitious sense, or not only in that sense, but in a systematic, structured way that was taken seriously by philosophers and physicians and generals and emperors alike. dreams were one of the mechanisms by which the divine communicated with the human. The god Asclepius, who presided over healing, communicated cures through dreams to sick people who slept in his temples. The god Morpheus, who was the shaper of dreams, moved through the darkness between the divine world and the human world with his brother Aislos and a third brother whose name meant false dream, and the border between true vision and mere fantasy was a constant preoccupation. The emperor's dreams were, in this framework, potentially the most significant dreams in the world. If the gods communicated through dreams, they communicated most importantly to the man whose decisions most directly affected the largest number of lives. The dream literature of the Roman Empire is full of imperial dream reports. Augustus dreaming of victories before battles, Domitian dreaming of his assassination, Constantine dreaming of the Cairo symbol that would become the Christian emblem. These accounts have been received differently by different historians in different periods. The dreams that predicted victory tend to have been reported after the victory was confirmed. The dreams that predicted death tend to have been attributed retrospectively. As historical evidence, the specific content of any particular imperial dream is essentially useless. But as evidence of the mental culture of the empire, the framework within which emperors and their courts understood the experience of lying in the dark, of the mind moving through its night journeys, of the visions that came in sleep, they are enormously useful. They tell us that the hours of Roman darkness were understood to be potentially charged with significance. That what came to you in the night was not merely neural noise, not merely the random misfiring of a tired brain, but potentially important. Potentially divine, this is the night that the emperors lay down into, not the meaningless void of unconsciousness that the secular modern world imagines, but a charged, inhabited space, full of the gods' attention, potentially full of their messages, requiring interpretation and attention and a certain respectful wariness. Going to sleep for a Roman emperor was an act of something more than rest. It was an act of entry into the dark and into whatever the dark had to offer. Nero and the nights he made for himself. We have reached Nero, and we should be careful here. Nero's reputation has had a complicated history. He was, by any measure, one of the most written about Roman emperors, and the writing about him comes predominantly from sources that were hostile, either because they were writing under later dynasties that had political reasons to portray the Julio-Claudians badly, or because they were personally invested in the philosophical tradition of the good ruler, and Nero was the empire's most vivid example of the bad ruler, and bad rulers were pedagogically useful. What is actually known about Nero, as opposed to what was said about Nero, is different enough from the popular image to be worth separating out. He was interested in the arts in a way that was, for a man of his class and time, genuinely unusual. Roman aristocrats were supposed to appreciate the arts from a distance, to fund them, patronize them, perhaps perform them in private settings. What they were not supposed to do was perform publicly, professionally, with real ambition about the quality of their performance. Nero performed publicly. He sang. He played the kithara, which was the professional-grade version of the lyre, a large and technically demanding instrument that required years of serious practice to play well. He competed in theatrical and musical festivals, actual formal competitions, winning prizes that his opponents were not exactly free to withhold, but that he apparently also genuinely wanted. This passion was, to traditional Roman aristocrats, deeply embarrassing, and it was also entirely real. Nero practiced. He worked at it. He had teachers. He used physical techniques, lying with laid weights on his chest to strengthen his diaphragm, avoiding foods believed to harm the voice, maintaining a consistent practice schedule that a genuine performer would use. Whether he was actually good is unanswerable. His audiences were in no position to say otherwise, but the consistency and detail of the sources' descriptions of his musical pursuits suggest something more than a dilettante's hobby. What does this have to do with midnight? Everything in Nero's case. Because for Nero, the night was not the quiet, private, internally oriented space that it was for Augustus or Claudius. The night was where the performing happened. The night was where the version of himself that he most wanted to be, the artist, the creator, the musician rather than the emperor, had room to exist. He performed at night. Formal performances, with an audience that may or may not have entirely wanted to be present, in the private theater he constructed at the palace or in other venues around the city. He held what Suetonius calls nocturnal performances, nighttime concerts and theatrical events that ran until very late, sometimes past dawn. He played music in his private rooms at night, alone or with a small group of companions who were genuine friends rather than political attendants, and these sessions could go on for many hours. He composed. He is credited with composing music that was performed during his lifetime, and that survived his death, at least for a time. The compositions are not analyzed anywhere in surviving ancient literature in sufficient detail to tell us anything concrete about them, but the attribution of genuine creative work is consistent across sources, and it is consistent with a man who spent this many hours doing this activity. His night performances had an audience, whether the audience wanted to be there or not. But there was also apparently a version of the nighttime music that was private. Nero alone, or with one or two trusted companions, playing for the pleasure of playing, the lyre in the lamplight, the music moving through the still night air of the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, the enormous palace complex he built after the Great Fire of 64 CE that consumed a significant portion of central Rome. The Domus Aurea deserves its own moment of attention, because it was, among other things, an extraordinary nighttime environment. It covered, at its full extent, somewhere between 100 and 300 acres of central Rome. Estimates vary because the complex was deliberately obscured by later emperors who built over it, and the full extent of what was built is still being mapped by archaeologists. It included parks, gardens, a lake in the valley that later became the site of the Colosseum, pavilions, dining rooms, and a main residential complex that ancient sources describe with a consistent astonishment that has probably not been diminished by rhetorical inflation. The main dining room, according to Suetonius, had a revolving ceiling. The panels rotated, driven by some mechanism, possibly hydraulic, possibly simpler, that allowed them to open and reveal the sky above, or to change the apparent position of the constellations overhead, while flower petals and perfumes fell from openings in the ceiling onto the guests below. The walls were faced with gold and inlaid with precious stones and mother of pearl. The floors were mosaic. Whether the revolving ceiling was exactly as described is debatable. Whether the general direction of the description is accurate, a building of extraordinary decorative ambition, designed to overwhelm and astonish its occupants, is not. This is the building Nero walked through at night. This is the place where he played music in the lamplight, the mosaics catching the flame, the gold walls breathing with the movement of the air. The gardens outside, if you stepped through any of the many doors that connected the interior to the exterior, filling with the night sounds of Rome, the distant cart wheels, the stars. Nero had a companion for some portion of his nighttime life, who appears in the sources in ways that historians have found both significant and difficult to interpret. A freedman named Pythagoras, no relation to the mathematician, with whom he apparently conducted a formal ceremony of marriage, or something structured like a marriage, Nero playing the role of the bride. This is reported by multiple sources with varying degrees of hostility and varying degrees of specificity. What it tells us about Nero's private emotional life is genuinely unclear. What it tells us about the atmosphere of the Neronian night, intimate, unconventional, shaped by Nero's own preferences rather than by the expectations of the court, is, in its broad outlines, probably accurate. His nights were, in short, his. He remade the imperial nighttime in his own image, filling it with music and performance and company of his own choosing and activities that made the senators uncomfortable and the traditional moralists reach for their writing tablets. Whether this was liberation or disaster, or both at once, probably depends on who was being asked and what their relationship to the emperor was. He died in 68 CE, at 30 years old, having been declared a public enemy by the Senate, having fled Rome in the chaos of the revolt that ended his reign, having arrived at a villa outside the city where his remaining companions, very few by this point, persuaded him that suicide was the only remaining option. He could not bring himself to do it immediately, and the scene as the ancient sources describe it is one of the more humanizing moments in any Roman emperor's death. The time running out, the men urging him, and Nero saying famously, "What an artist dies in me. Whatever we make of him, and there is a great deal to make, and a great deal of it is not good, that line is real." Something in him genuinely believed it. The artist who had played music in the lamplight of the Domus Aurea, who had sung for audiences that had no choice but to applaud, who had spent his nights in the pursuit of beauty as he understood it, that man was dying and he knew it, and he marked the moment. The lamp going out on the musician, the gold walls left to someone else. The Flavian pause ambient, a quieter night, less elaborate, a working household settling down, distant dogs, stone floors, plain furniture. And as the night deepens further, we come to the emperors who came after. After Nero came what the historian Suetonius calls the year of the four emperors, 69 CE, in which Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian all claimed the purple, each briefly, each violently, each swept away by the military and political forces that had made the empire stable under the Julio-Claudians and now demonstrated what happened when that stability was removed. Vespasian, who emerged from this chaos as the founder of the Flavian dynasty, was a different kind of man from his predecessors. He was from a modest family, not spectacularly wealthy, not from the ancient aristocracy, not connected to the Julio-Claudians by anything except the fact that he had served them as a general and made himself indispensable. He was blunt, earthy, given to crude humor that his more aristocratic predecessors would have considered beneath them. He was also extremely competent, frugal with public money, and utterly without the philosophical pretensions that had characterized Claudius or the artistic ambitions that had characterized Nero. His midnight habits, to the extent they can be reconstructed, were those of a general who had spent decades in military camps. He woke early, very early, and so the midnight of his schedule was simply the portion of his night that preceded the very early morning at which he habitually rose and began work. He slept deeply, briefly, and without apparent drama. He rose before dawn. He began his official business before most of his court was awake. His successors Titus and Domitian were more complicated. Titus, who ruled for only 2 years, 79-81 CE, is remembered by ancient sources with the kind of unalloyed praise that always makes historians slightly suspicious, because the ancient sources had reasons to praise him that were not entirely biographical. He died young at 40 of a fever, which meant he never had the time to do the things that might have complicated his reputation, and he was conveniently positioned as the beloved contrast to his brother Domitian, who came after and whom nobody liked. What we know of Titus's nighttime life is limited by the brevity of his reign and the nature of the sources. He was apparently fond of dinner parties that ran late, generous with wine, generous with company, the kind of host who wanted his guests to feel that his house was their house, and that the night was long and there was no hurry. He had a famous friendship with the Jewish princess Berenice, who was in Rome during his reign, and whose relationship with him Tacitus describes in terms that suggest genuine affection on both sides. Whether Berenice was part of the nighttime domestic world of the palace during this period is not documented clearly, but it is a reasonable thing to wonder about. Domitian is the more interesting case. He was, by contemporary accounts, deeply suspicious, increasingly isolated, and consumed by a fear of assassination that grew more pronounced as his reign went on, not unreasonably, since he was in fact eventually assassinated. He instituted a reign of terror in his later years. He had senators executed on what critics considered flimsy pretexts. He had a habit of impaling flies on a stylus. This is documented specifically by Suetonius, who cannot resist the detail, and when asked whether there was anyone with the emperor, a courtier replied truthfully that there was not even a fly. At night, Domitian patrolled. He walked his own palace at night in the way that a man walks who is afraid of what might be lurking in the parts he cannot see. He is described by sources as restless, unable to stay in one place for long, moving through the corridors of his own residence with the agitated wariness of someone who knows that the next corner might contain whatever he is most afraid of. He had the walls of certain corridors and rooms lined with polished stone, specifically a bright reflective stone called Cappadocian marble or fengite, which caught and reflected light so that he could see behind himself without turning around. He walked down corridors that showed him in the walls a reflection of the space behind him, his own shadow following him, the empty corridor extending back into darkness, visible at the corner of his eye in the polished stone. This is the midnight ritual of a man who has made enemies he cannot count. The reflective walls are both practical and terrible, a security measure that also inevitably forces him to see himself constantly. The emperor reflected back at himself, walking through his own palace in the dark at 3 in the morning. Hadrian and the walls he built around darkness, we should pause here and breathe. It is the middle of the night now in our own telling, and we are moving toward the period that many historians regard as the height of Roman imperial achievement. The Antonine Age, the age of the 5 good emperors, the period from Nerva through Marcus Aurelius in which the empire was, by most measures, at its most stable, most prosperous, and most capably governed. But before we arrive at Marcus Aurelius, who will occupy our attention for a long and devoted chapter, we need to pass through Hadrian. Publius Aelius Hadrianus, ruler of Rome from 117 to 138 CE, one of the most traveled emperors in Roman history. The man who built the wall in Britain, along the northern frontier of the province, a continuous physical barrier running from the Solway Firth in the west to the Tyne estuary in the east, a distance of roughly 73 miles, which still exists in substantial portions, and which is one of the most remarkable archaeological monuments in the world. He also built walls in other senses, walls of intellectual interest and artistic ambition, walls of personal reserve behind which his real self remained largely invisible to most of his court. He was a polymath. Interested in architecture, he redesigned the Pantheon, the building in Rome that stands most completely intact from antiquity, and may have designed many other buildings himself. Interested in literature and philosophy, interested in visual art. He was Greek-speaking and Greek-reading in a way that went beyond the normal educated Romans' engagement with Greek culture, into something more like genuine identification. He spent much of his reign traveling, not the ceremonial progresses that other emperors made, but genuine extended journeys to the provinces. Britain, Germany, the Danube frontier, Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, North Africa. He traveled to see, to understand, to be present in the physical reality of the empire he governed. He visited the troops on the frontiers. He inspected the administrative apparatus. He stood at the edges of the empire and looked outward into whatever lay beyond the Roman world. What are the nights of a traveling emperor, different from the nights of an emperor fixed in Rome or on a private island? The traveling court moved with an infrastructure, a mobile household that included bedding, cooking equipment, bathing facilities of a portable kind, secretaries and their materials, medical staff, personal attendants, and whatever entertainers and companions the emperor wanted in his immediate company. This infrastructure was set up each evening when the party arrived at whatever destination or camp was the night's stopping point, and it created, within whatever building or camp structure was available, a facsimile of the imperial household. Hadrian's nighttime activities, based on what can be reconstructed from the scattered evidence across multiple ancient sources, combined elements we have already seen with some that are more specific to his particular character. He read extensively. His literary interests were broad: Greek poetry, philosophy, history, and he is credited with writing poetry himself, some of which survives, including a famous brief poem to his own soul written apparently near the end of his life that is as moving and strange as anything in Latin poetry. Little wandering spirit, gentle and slight, guest and companion of my body's clay, where now do you depart to, pale and bare, no longer playful as you were? This is a man thinking at night in the late hours about what he is and what he is made of. The little wandering spirit is the anima, the animating principle, the thing that leaves the body at death and goes, where? The poem does not say. It asks the question and lets it stand. Hadrian had, or developed, a severe and complicated relationship with a young man named Antinous, a Bithynian Greek who entered his court at some point in the 120 CA and became, over the years that followed, the most important private relationship of his life. Antinous drowned in the Nile in 130 CA, at approximately 19 years of age, under circumstances that were never fully explained and that have been speculated about ever since. Hadrian's grief was, by all accounts, genuine and overwhelming. He deified Antinous, which was an extraordinary act for a private person who was not a member of the imperial family, founded a city named after him in Egypt, and commissioned an unprecedented artistic program. Statues, busts, and reliefs of Antinous were produced in such numbers and distributed so widely that they are now among the most frequently surviving examples of ancient portraiture. Hundreds of Antinous images still exist. The private dimensions of this relationship, what it meant to Hadrian in the daily and nightly texture of his life, how Antinous occupied the hours of the traveling court, what his absence meant in the practical arrangements of the imperial household, these are largely invisible to us. Ancient sources are guarded about the specifics, and the modern interpretive tradition has been both too confident and too reductive in its treatment of the relationship. What we can say is that Hadrian's nights in the years after 130 CE were shaped by an absence, by a loss that had been filled with a specific presence for several years. And this kind of loss, which is simply the human experience of grief concentrated in the particular quiet of the night, when the mind has nothing to occupy it and every silence sounds like absence, is not made less real or less difficult by belonging to an emperor. He built Antinous' city. He made the statues. He created, out of his grief, a legacy that survived his own death by 2 millennia and still survives today. Whatever he did in the darkness of his tent or his chamber in those years, the building outward from it was extraordinary. The meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and now we arrive at the chapter that, in some ways, all the preceding chapters have been preparing for. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, Emperor of Rome from 161 to 180 CE. The last of the 5 good emperors, the philosopher-king in the tradition of Plato's ideal, the man Cassius Dio described as a truly virtuous ruler who made genuine efforts to be what an emperor ought to be. And the author of a private document, never intended for publication, written in Greek rather than Latin for additional privacy, probably composed across a period of many years that we now call the Meditations, and that is one of the most remarkable texts to survive from the ancient world. The Meditations are not a treatise. They are not a finished philosophical work meant to be read in order, with an argument building from beginning to end. They are notes, reminders. The kind of thing you write not for an audience but for yourself, not to demonstrate your ideas but to practice them, to keep them sharp and present in the face of the daily temptation to forget. They were written, based on the headings of certain books, during military campaigns on the Danube frontier, specifically the Marcomannic Wars of the 170s, a series of serious and demanding campaigns against Germanic tribes that Marcus spent much of the last decade of his reign fighting. He was not, by temperament or by training, a military man. He was a philosopher who became an emperor and was then required to spend his emperorship doing the least philosophical thing imaginable, commanding armies, making strategic decisions with enormous consequences, watching men die. He wrote in the night. This is not directly stated, but it is almost certainly true. The Meditations have the character of night writing, private, unguarded, written without an audience. written in the particular kind of honesty that the dark hours and the absence of observers encourage. They are also written in a register of exhaustion, sometimes, that suggests a man writing at the end of a long day rather than at the beginning, the thoughts having been turned over during the hours of action, and only now finding their way onto the page in the quiet of the tent. What did Marcus Aurelius's nights look like? His tent on the Danube was, by the standards of any previous emperor's accommodation, modest. A military campaign tent, better appointed than a common soldier's but still fundamentally a tent. Canvas and wooden poles, a floor of packed earth covered with mats, furniture that could be assembled and disassembled as the camp moved, oil lamps providing the only light. He slept on the ground, or nearly so. There is a tradition, mentioned in one source and probably exaggerated in subsequent tradition, that he slept on a hard bed, barely more than a board, as a philosophical practice. The Stoics generally disapproved of luxury, including the luxury of soft beds. Epictetus, one of Marcus's most important influences, had slept on a simple mat as a slave and continued doing so after his freedom. The hard bed was, for Marcus, probably a genuine expression of philosophical principle, not a performance. He rose early, earlier than he might have wished. In Book V of the Meditations, there is a passage that every person who has ever hated getting out of bed on a cold morning should read. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. What do I have to complain of if I'm going to do what I was born for, the things I was brought into the world to do? Or is this what I was created for, to huddle under the blankets and stay warm? This is a man talking to himself in the dark, arguing himself out of bed, using philosophy as the lever to pry himself away from the warmth. This is the Emperor of Rome having, in writing, the exact same internal negotiation that most people have with themselves most mornings. It is, in its mundane specificity, one of the most endearing things in all of ancient literature. His nighttime writing practice, if we accept the premise that the Meditations were largely a night practice, had a specific character that distinguishes it from the writing of other emperors we have examined. It was not practical. It was not letters or administrative documents or historical scholarship. It was self-examination. The Meditations are, over and over again, a man asking himself whether he is living up to his own principles, whether he has been patient enough, whether he has been just enough, whether he has let himself be moved by things that should not move him, whether he has exercised the proper philosophical detachment from external goods and from the opinions of others. The self-examination is rigorous and consistent, and frankly, somewhat relentless. There is a quality to the Meditations that approaches self-punishment if you read long stretches of it, not because he is cruel to himself, but because the standard he holds himself to is so genuinely high and so genuinely serious. How much more grievous are the consequences of anger than the causes of it, he writes in one place. And you understand that this is not a theoretical observation. He has been angry. He is reminding himself in the night that anger is not useful. That the cost of anger is always higher than whatever provoked it. He is filing this down in the wax of his mind. Confine yourself to the present, he writes in another place, and this too is not theory. This is a man on a military campaign, surrounded by death and politics and the noise of an empire under pressure, trying to remember that the only moment he can actually occupy is the one he is in. Do not indulge in dreams of what you lack, he writes, and here we are, the night thought. The dark hour's temptation to mental travel through regret and desire and the imagined futures that might have been. He knows this temptation. He fights it. He writes the reminder to himself in the night so that it is there when the temptation comes. He slept, we know, and dreamed. He records in the Meditations that he asked the gods in dreams for remedies for certain illnesses, specifically blood spitting and dizziness, which he suffered from throughout his reign. He followed the Asclepian tradition of dream medicine, which the educated, philosophically sophisticated emperor should perhaps have been too sophisticated for, but which he apparently practiced alongside his philosophical stoicism without apparent contradiction. The gods came to him in dreams. He took the guidance they offered. He also, based on physical evidence, suffered from chronic pain. He had stomach and chest problems throughout his life, probably worsened by campaign conditions and by whatever specific illness troubled him in the later years. Some historians have suggested he suffered from a form of tuberculosis. Others have proposed chronic ulcers. Others simply note that the ancient world offered few effective remedies for many conditions. He used theriac, a complex compound drug of which opium was one ingredient, under medical supervision. And this use was both documented and, in the Roman medical context, entirely respectable. The managing of pain with available pharmaceutical means was a medical problem, not a moral one. What this means for his nights is that the darkness was physically inhabited as well as intellectually occupied. He lay down into a body that was often in some degree of discomfort, that needed management and attention, that did not always cooperate with the demands placed on it by an active campaigning emperor. The philosopher king lay down at night into a physical reality of pain and tiredness, and the specific ache of a body that had been asking too much of itself for too long. And in that body, in that tent, on that hard bed, with the camp sounds around him and the Danube somewhere not far away, and the Germanic tribes beyond it and the empire behind him and the night overhead, he wrote, "Let us stay with the writing for a little while longer." Book II of the Meditations begins with the phrase, "Begin the morning by saying to thyself, I shall meet with the busy body, the ungrateful, the overbearing, the treacherous, the envious, the unneighborly." This is a morning meditation, a practice of preparing the self for the difficulties of the day by anticipating them. You will meet difficult people today. This is certain. The question is not whether they will be difficult, but whether you will be equipped to handle the difficulty without losing yourself. But this morning preparation had to come from somewhere. Philosopher does not wake up prepared. The preparation is achieved across the hours of the night, in the writing and the thinking and the gradual working out of what matters and what does not. The morning meditation is the output of the nighttime work. He wrote about death with a frequency that might seem morbid from some angles, but that is, within the Stoic framework, simply honest. Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly. He wrote that. He meant it. He returned to it in various forms across the different books of the Meditations. Each return a slightly different angle on the same fundamental point. The time is finite. The self is temporary. The work of being a good human being and a good emperor is urgent precisely because there is not unlimited time in which to do it. He died in 180 CE on the Danube frontier, probably near the modern city of Vienna, at 58 years old. He had been emperor for 19 years. The Marcomannic Wars, which he had spent the last decade fighting, were not yet concluded when he died. His son Commodus succeeded him, and the principate that Marcus had tried so hard to maintain with virtue and reason and stoic self-examination began, almost immediately, to come apart in ways that Marcus, lying awake in his tent, writing his reminders to himself in the dark, had probably feared. He left behind the Meditations, the private notes that were never supposed to be published, that survived somehow across the centuries in a single manuscript tradition, and were first printed in the 16th century and have been in print in multiple languages in every decade since. A man's night thoughts, written on a campaign tent's lamplight, read now by millions of people in hundreds of languages. The lamp is still burning in a way. The tent is still open. You are still welcome to raid. The baths, the oil, and the preparation for sleep. We have spent a great deal of time in the minds of emperors tonight. Let us, for this chapter, spend some time in their bodies, in the specific physical rituals through which these men prepared themselves for the dark hours. The Roman bath was not simply a place to get clean. This is the essential thing to understand. The Roman bath was a total environment, a place where the body was systematically taken through a sequence of temperatures, textures, and sensory experiences that were understood to be simultaneously hygienic, medical, social, and restorative. The bath was not a chore. The bath was one of the primary pleasures of Roman life, available at different scales to every stratum of society. For the emperors, the bath was conducted in private facilities of extraordinary quality. The personal bathing suite of an imperial palace included, at minimum, the apoditerium, the changing room where clothing was removed and stored, the frigidarium, the cold room with a cold plunge pool, the tepidarium, the warm intermediate room, the caldarium, the hot room with a heated pool, and in many cases additional rooms with different specific temperatures or purposes, plus dedicated spaces for massage, oiling, scraping, and hair care. The heating was provided by the hypocaust system, a raised floor structure with hollow chambers beneath it, through which hot air was circulated from a furnace outside the bathing rooms. The floors of the warm and hot rooms were heated by this system, and additional heat moved through hollow tiles in the walls. A well-managed hypocaust could heat a room to temperatures that modern spa visitors would recognize as genuinely impressive. The sequence of an imperial bath in the evening might go something like this. The emperor arrived in the apoditerium, where personal attendants, slaves trained specifically for this purpose, with their own hierarchy and specializations, removed his outer clothing, his sandals, his rings, and any other jewelry. He proceeded to the tepidarium, the warm room, where he rested for some time in the ambient heat, allowing the body to begin its gradual heating, the muscles to loosen, the day's accumulation of tension to begin releasing from the joints and the back and the neck. From the tepidarium, the caldarium, the hot room, the hottest space in the sequence, with a large heated pool and sometimes additional steam. Here the sweating that was considered therapeutically essential happened. The body sweated out the impurities of the day. The Roman medical writers were unanimous that this was a central mechanism of the bath's health benefits, and the pores opened, and the skin became soft and receptive. From the caldarium, the strigiling. Olive oil was applied to the skin, not olive oil of the culinary grade, but perfumed oil, scented with whatever the emperor's personal preferences ran to: cedar, rose, cinnamon, nard, the complex compound perfumes that Roman perfumers produced in considerable variety. The oil was spread across the body, and then a strigil, a curved, blunt-edged scraping tool made of metal or bone, was drawn across the skin repeatedly, in long strokes, removing the oil and with it the loosened sweat and grime and dead skin cells. The combination of heat, oil, and scraping was remarkably effective as a cleaning method, and in the absence of soap in anything like the modern sense, it was the primary cleaning technology of the ancient world. From the strigiling, the frigidarium, the cold plunge, this shock of cold water was considered essential. It closed the pores that the heat had opened, prevented the body from cooling too gradually and catching fever, reinvigorated the skin and the nervous system. The cold plunge was bracing and brief and followed by careful toweling and reoiling with lighter, dried-in oils. The whole sequence, for someone with imperial leisure to spend on it, might take 2 or 3 hours. Done in the evening, it was designed to leave the body in a specific state, clean, warm, soft, and with a profound physical ease that was the precondition for good sleep. After the bath came the meal, if a meal had not preceded the bath. Roman dining had its own elaborate protocols, and the evening meal, the cena, was the main meal of the day, potentially a long and elaborate affair for the wealthy, a simpler but still significant event for those of more modest means. For emperors who were attentive to their health, Augustus, Marcus Aurelius, to some extent Claudius, the evening meal was managed carefully with respect to its relationship to sleep. The Roman medical writers all agreed that eating a heavy meal immediately before sleep was harmful. It burdened the digestive system during the hours it should be resting. It heated the body in ways that disturbed sleep. It produced the kind of uncomfortable, vivid, fragmentary dreams associated with digestive activity rather than the calm, deep dreams of a well-rested sleeper. The ideal pre-sleep meal was light and easily digestible. Bread, a little soft cheese, fruit. Perhaps a small amount of meat, not heavily spiced. Wine, which was considered medically beneficial in moderate quantities, diluted with water to reduce its immediate intoxicating effect while preserving its warming restorative properties. Heavy spices were avoided before sleep. So were foods considered to produce wind, flatulence, which was not merely embarrassing but medically problematic, as it was believed to interfere with the proper digestion during sleep process. Legumes in general were approached with some caution for the same reason. Raw vegetables were viewed with suspicion. Overly rich sauces were saved for the midday meal. This was all very specific and very considered. The emperor eating his light evening meal, preparing his body for the long night ahead, was not simply satisfying hunger, but participating in a medical regimen designed to optimize the quality of his sleep. The bedroom itself, as we have touched on for Augustus, was prepared for sleep in ways that a Roman physician would recognize as correct. The cubiculum, the bedroom, was ideally a small room, not out of any poverty of taste, but because small rooms were warmer in winter, cooler in summer, and easier to make dark and quiet than large ones. The Romans had a sophisticated understanding of microclimate, and the design of sleeping rooms in wealthy houses reflects this. Small, positioned away from street noise, with small windows that could be fully shuttered, and with access to ventilation from an interior courtyard rather than from the street. The bed itself, the lectus cubicularis, the bedroom bed as opposed to the dining couch or the study couch, was wooden typically with a rope or webbing support, and a mattress stuffed with wool, feathers, or straw depending on the wealth of the household. Imperial mattresses would have been of the highest quality available, soft, well-packed, with linen coverings and blankets of fine wool. Silk coverings appear in the sources from the late Republic onward as a marker of extreme luxury, viewed with the characteristic Roman ambivalence toward anything that suggested too much comfort. Pillows were used, multiple pillows in the Roman style, supporting not just the head but the upper body, allowing a slightly elevated sleeping position that was considered medically beneficial for digestion, in the same way that modern advice sometimes suggests elevating the head for people with acid reflux. Scents were part of the sleeping environment. Certain plants were believed to promote sleep. Valerian, which actually does have mild sedative properties. Violet, whose scent was considered calming. Rose, which was everywhere in the Roman luxury environment and whose perfume was associated with relaxation. Potpourris or sachets of dried herbs might be placed near the bed. The pillow stuffed with dried flowers is not a medieval invention, it has Roman antecedents. A slave attendant would have extinguished all but one lamp, or perhaps all the lamps entirely if the emperor preferred complete darkness. The lamp left burning would have been placed in a position where it provided enough ambient light to navigate by if needed in the night, but not enough to prevent sleep. The wick would have been trimmed to a low, steady flame. The emperor would have been helped into bed, dressed in a sleeping garment, warm enough for the season, and the attendants would have withdrawn to the anteroom or to their sleeping positions near the door, close enough to hear if they were needed, far enough to allow the illusion of privacy. And then, the night, the lamp flame in the corner, moving very gently, the distant sounds of Rome or the camp or the sea, the darkness at the edges of the room where the lamplight did not reach. And the emperor lying on his bed in his own silence, in the particular and unrepeatable solitude of the person who has finished the day and not yet entered the night's unconsciousness. What was he thinking? That is the question that runs through this whole story, and that no surviving source answers with complete satisfaction. Because the thoughts of men lying awake in the dark are private in the most fundamental possible sense. They are not performed for anyone. They have no witnesses except the person thinking them. They leave no residue in the historical record except the very faint impressions that surface sometimes in private letters, in autobiographical writing, in the kind of literary work that comes from a life's accumulation of quiet hours. We know some of what Augustus thought about in the night, his health, his letters, the governance of the empire he had built from nothing. We know some of what Marcus thought, the reminders to himself, the stoic preparations, the pressure of death gently applied to the urgency of living well. We know something of what Tiberius saw from his cliff above the sea, and something of what Nero heard when he played music in the lamplight. But the thoughts themselves, the actual content of the nighttime mind, the specific worry or memory or desire or fear that moved through these men as they lay in their beds listening to the Rome night, those are gone, the way all private things eventually go. What remains is the context, the rooms, the lamps, the sound of the city, the physical arrangements for sleep, the rituals that surrounded and prepared for and followed from the dark hours. These things are recoverable in fragments from the archaeology and the texts and the material culture that has survived. And so we have been reconstructing them, all night here together. Septimius Severus and the African knight Lucius Septimius Severus was born in Leptis Magna, in what is now Libya, in 145 CE. He became emperor in 193 CE, after another chaotic year of competing claimants, the year of the 5 emperors, and he ruled until his death in 211 CE. He is a significant figure in Roman history for several reasons. He was the first African-born emperor. He fundamentally altered the relationship between the imperial government and the army, directly connecting military loyalty to imperial favor in ways that his predecessors had maintained more indirectly. He extended Roman control in Britain. He died at York of illness during a campaign in northern Britain, and he was an aggressive builder, leaving substantial monuments in Rome and throughout the empire. He was also, according to ancient sources, a man who had a very specific relationship with dreams and nighttime visions. Before he became emperor, before he was anything more than one of several competing generals in the chaos of 193 CE, Septimius Severus apparently had a series of dreams and omens that he interpreted as predicting his rise to imperial power. This is standard ancient biographical material, the kind of retroactive sign spotting that appears in almost every ancient biography of a successful person. But in Severus's case, the specificity of the accounts and the details he apparently provided himself suggest genuine personal investment in the dream tradition. He married his second wife Julia Domna, a Syrian woman from a family of Syrian sun priests, specifically, according to the biographical tradition, because her horoscope predicted she would marry a king. He was not yet a king or any kind of ruler when he commissioned this horoscope. He married on the basis of an astrological prediction about her future. Whether this is literally how the decision was made, or whether it is biographical legend, the attitude it reveals is consistent. Severus was a man for whom the nighttime world of signs and omens, and the messages embedded in sleep, was very real and very important. Julia Domna herself was one of the most intellectually formidable women in Roman imperial history. She gathered around her a circle of philosophers, scientists, and literary men that historians call the Circle of Julia Domna, and this circle produced or associated with some of the most significant intellectual works of the era. She was a genuine patron and participant in the intellectual life of her time. Their household then was not only a center of political power, but a center of intellectual activity, and the nighttime rhythms of that household included the kind of extended conversation, philosophical, astronomical, theological, that the presence of Julia Domna and her circle would naturally generate. Septimius Severus died at York in the cold and rain of February 211 CE. He was 65 years old. He had traveled from the African sun to the rain-soaked edge of the Roman world and died there, in a frontier city, as far from Leptis Magna as it is possible to get while remaining within the empire. He is reported to have said, toward the end, that he had received everything from fortune and had found it profitless. His last words, according to one source, were a crisp military instruction: "Come, if there is anything to be done, let us be about it." He had spent his nights, across a long career of military campaigning and imperial governance, attending to the signs in the sky and the messages in his dreams. He had married on the basis of an omen. He had risen to the top of the Roman world on the basis of military competence and the ability to read the moment, which is its own kind of attending to signs. The dreams had, in his case, been accurate, or he had lived in a way that made them accurate, which are from a certain angle the same thing. Diocletian and the emperor who retired to his garden. Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, we should visit an emperor who did something no emperor before him had ever done, and almost no emperor after him managed to do either. He voluntarily retired. Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus, Diocletian, ruled as emperor from 284 to 305 CE, a reign of 21 years that transformed the structure of the Roman Empire in fundamental ways that are still being analyzed and debated by historians. He instituted the Tetrarchy, the system of 4 simultaneous rulers, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, governing different parts of the empire from different bases, in an attempt to solve the empire's long-standing problem of political succession by institutionalizing it. He rebuilt the administrative and military structures of the state after the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of near-continuous civil war and military disaster. He persecuted the Christians in what is known as the Great Persecution, the last and most severe of the Roman persecutions, beginning in 303 CE, and then in 305 CE he abdicated, stepped down, announced that he was retiring, that his co-emperor Maximian would do the same, and that the 2 junior rulers would become the new senior Augustus. He went to his palace at Split in what is now Croatia, and he grew cabbages. He actually grew cabbages. This is documented. When a former colleague, Maximian, later pressured him to return to power, Diocletian reportedly said that if Maximian could see the cabbages he had planted with his own hands, he would not ask this of him. The palace of Diocletian at Split is one of the most remarkable survivals of antiquity. It is still there, not as a ruin, as an inhabited space. The medieval city of Split grew up inside and around Diocletian's palace, so thoroughly integrating the ancient structure into the medieval and modern city that the two are inseparable. The ancient colonnades became medieval streets. The ancient mausoleum became a Christian cathedral. The peristyle, the great colonnaded courtyard, became a public square that is still used today. The layout of the palace reflects its dual nature as a military fortress and an imperial retirement residence. It is rectangular, with corner towers and wall towers at regular intervals, like a legionary camp translated into palace architecture. Inside this fortified shell, the private quarters occupied the southern half, looking out over the sea. The northern half contained service areas, barracks, and the main entrance. The emperor's private apartments are on the seaward side, large rooms with windows that, in the original construction, would have looked directly onto the Adriatic. Waking in those rooms, or lying awake in those rooms in the night, you would hear the sea. Not the distant, imagined sea of a hilltop palace, but the immediate, close-up sea, audible from the sleeping room, the salt smell moving through whatever ventilation the windows provided. Diocletian slept to the sound of the Adriatic. He gardened by day and presumably read and reflected by night, in the lamp-lit rooms overlooking the sea. He received visitors. Not emperors came to ask him to return to power was just one such visit, and he managed, with apparent serenity, the extraordinary transition from being the most powerful man in the Roman world to being a retired man in a seaside fortress with a vegetable garden. Ancient sources are divided on whether to treat this retirement with admiration or with something more like suspicion. The Roman tradition did not have many models for voluntary retirement from power. The usual career trajectory for a Roman emperor was upward and then violently terminal. Diocletian's calm withdrawal to his cabbages violated the expected narrative, but he lived. He lived in his palace by the sea for approximately 9 more years after his abdication, dying in 311 or 312 CE at somewhere between 60 and 70 years of age, under circumstances that are not entirely clear, but that ancient sources do not attribute to violence. He died in his retirement, in his palace, presumably in his own bed. This is not a small thing. It is, in fact, for a Roman emperor, an almost unique thing. Constantine and the night vision that changed the world, the night of October 27, 312 CE. The army of Constantine, Flavius Valerius Constantinus, who had been elevated to the purple by his troops in Britain in 306 CE, and who had spent the following years fighting his way toward the sole control of the Western Empire, was camped outside Rome, at the Milvian Bridge over the Tiber, preparing to fight the army of Maxentius, who controlled Rome and who would fight the following day to hold it. Constantine later told Eusebius of Caesarea, his biographer, that on the previous day he had seen a vision in the sky, a cross of light, and words beside it in Greek that read in hoc signo vinces, by this sign you will conquer. And that night, he told Eusebius, Christ appeared to him in a dream and told him to put the sign of the Chi-Rho, the superimposed Greek letters X and P, the first 2 letters of Christos, on his soldiers' shields. He did. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge was fought on October 28, 312. Maxentius's forces were defeated, and Maxentius himself drowned in the Tiber when the pontoon bridge behind his army collapsed. Constantine entered Rome as the master of the Western Empire. The question of what actually happened on the night of October 27, What Constantine actually saw or dreamed or experienced, and what he actually believed about it, is one of the most analyzed questions in the history of Christianity, and we are not going to resolve it here. What we can do is situate it within the larger story we have been telling tonight. Constantine was a man of the same period, the same culture, the same intellectual formation as all the emperors we have discussed. He had grown up in a world where dreams carried divine messages. He had grown up in a world where omens and signs and the interpretation of the sky's phenomena were taken seriously by educated, intelligent, powerful men. He had grown up in a world where, on the night before a critical battle, a man would naturally look inward and upward, seeking whatever guidance was available. The specific content of what he saw or dreamed, the Cairo, the words, the divine figure, may have been Christian, or it may have been something that was subsequently reinterpreted as Christian, or it may have been something else entirely that Constantine, who was already in contact with Christians and aware of Christian symbolism, chose to understand in Christian terms. These are questions that cannot be fully answered. What is unambiguous is that the night before the Milvian Bridge was a specific kind of night in Constantine's experience. A night of preparation, of seeking, of the pre-battle emotional intensity that would naturally sharpen the mind's attention to anything, internal or external, visual or oniric, that felt like guidance. He had been doing this in one form or another his whole life. He came from a tradition that expected the night to carry messages. What differed was the specific message he received, or understood himself to have received, and what he chose to do with it. The world he woke up into on October 28, 312, was in the very long view a different world than the one he had fallen asleep in. Not because of what he had seen in the night, necessarily, but because of what he did with it. The shields were painted. The battle was fought. The world turned. Constantine's later nighttime life, as emperor of the increasingly Christian empire, had its own distinctive texture. He built churches. The great basilicas of Rome and, later, Constantinople, the Lateran Basilica, the original St. Peter's over what Christians identified as Peter's tomb, the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. These buildings gave the Christian community a new kind of architectural presence, translating the old imperial forms of the basilica and the mausoleum into sacred space. He legislated Sunday as the official rest day of the empire in 321 CE, the first legal establishment of what became the Western Week, with its rhythm of 6 days of work followed by one of rest. The night before Sunday, then, became a specific kind of night, a preparation for rest and worship, different in character from the nights before working days. He was baptized on his deathbed, which was standard practice for Christian emperors of the period, not because they doubted their Christianity, but because baptism was understood to wash away all sins, and dying shortly after baptism ensured arriving in the next world in a clean state. He died in 337 CE, at Nicomedia in modern Turkey, at approximately 60 years of age. The world he left was so different from the world he had been born into that it is genuinely difficult to hold both realities in the mind simultaneously. The Rome of Constantine's death still had its old gods, its old temples, its old philosophical traditions, but the trajectory was set. The night vision at the Milvian Bridge, whatever it was, had done its work. Julian and the last pagan night one emperor deserves particular attention as we move toward the later period of the empire. Julian. Flavius Claudius Julianus, Julian, known to Christian history as Julian the Apostate, became emperor in 361 CE and died in 363 CE, after ruling for less than 2 years. He was the last non-Christian emperor of Rome, and his attempt to reverse Constantine's religious settlement, to restore the old gods to their former position, to rebuild the pagan temples and revive the old philosophical traditions. This attempt failed, and it failed relatively quickly, and after his death the Christian empire continued without significant interruption. But Julian himself is a fascinating figure, and his nighttime habits are among the most carefully documented of any emperors, partly because he wrote extensively himself, and partly because he had an unusually engaged modern scholarly following. He read voraciously, in the way of a man who had been educated partly in isolation. He was kept under a kind of house arrest in his youth by his cousin, the Emperor Constantius II, who was understandably nervous about rival claimants to the throne, and who had used that isolation to develop an intellectual intensity that was, by the time he reached power, genuinely formidable. His nights were long and bookish. He slept less, he said himself, than he probably should have, sacrificing sleep to reading and writing with the slightly self-congratulatory discipline of a man who genuinely enjoys the sacrifice. He wrote philosophical works, satires, panegyrics, and an enormous number of letters. The letters survive in substantial numbers and are invaluable for understanding his mind and his world. He was a Neoplatonist, intellectually, a follower of the philosophical tradition descended from Plato through Plotinus, which held that the material world was a pale reflection of higher, immaterial realities, and that the goal of philosophy was to ascend from the material to the divine through a combination of intellectual work and spiritual practice. This tradition had a sophisticated theology of the night. The darkness was not empty but full of the presence of the divine, which was most easily accessible when the distractions of the material world were quiet. Julian prayed at night. Specifically, he performed religious rituals after midnight, in the second and third watches, that were part of his Neoplatonic practice. He lit fires and offered sacrifice, and engaged in the kind of concentrated theurgical practice that his philosophical tradition prescribed for direct contact with the divine. These practices were private, conducted in his own rooms rather than in public religious settings, and they are documented partly by his own writings and partly by the hostile accounts of Christian sources who viewed them with undisguised alarm. His last night, the night before the battle in which he was killed in Mesopotamia in 363 CE, a spear wound during a skirmish, is described by sources with the kind of portentous detail that retrospective biography loves. He spent the night reading, apparently, working, doing what he always did. The lamps burned until late, the books were open. The philosophical work continued until the light came. He was 31 when he died. After Julian, the line of pagan emperors ended. The empire was, from Theodosius I onward, definitively Christian, and the old religious practices that had shaped the nighttime life of Rome for centuries, the omens, the sacrifice, the temple rituals, the old gods in their dark hours, these retreated gradually from the official world and into the margins. The emperors still lay awake in the night. They still had their fears and their habits and their midnight rituals. But the framework within which they understood those hours was changing. From the complex polytheism of the classical world, with its gods of crossroads and dreams and boundary times, to the monotheism of the new faith, with its own nighttime practices, prayer, vigil, the liturgical hours that structured the Christian night. The night did not change, only the names of the powers that inhabited it. The kitchen in the night before we come to our final meditation and the slow close of this long night. Let us spend some time in the kitchen, because no account of imperial midnight rituals is complete without the food. The Roman imperial kitchen never truly slept. This is an architectural and logistical reality, a household that served an emperor and his court. Guests and staff numbering in the hundreds on even quiet days required a food infrastructure that operated on a timeline entirely different from the official schedule of the emperor himself. Bread had to be baked before dawn, which meant the ovens had to be stoked, and the dough prepared deep in the second watch. Animals that had been slaughtered the previous day needed to be processed overnight. Certain sauces and preparations required long, slow cooking that started in the evening and ran through the night. The imperial kitchen, then, was a warm, working, fragrant, active space at every hour. The contrast with the quiet corridors and lampless rooms of the private apartments above or nearby was complete. Here in the kitchen quarter, the night was alive with the sound of work. Slaves and freedmen who worked the kitchen lived on their own schedule, inverted relative to the world of the formal day. They worked in the warm dark, by the light of multiple lamps and the ambient glow of fires. They talked quietly among themselves, the talk of people who worked together in confined spaces at odd hours, intimate and horizontal in its social dynamics in ways that the formal hierarchies of the household did not normally permit. What did the emperors eat from this kitchen in the middle of the night? Augustus, as we know, ate little and simply. A late-night snack for Augustus, if he needed to eat in the night at all, would have been bread, coarse bread, not the fine white bread preferred by the upper classes, which he apparently did not care for, and perhaps fruit, dried figs or fresh depending on the season, or a few olives. Simple food, farmers' food by Roman aristocratic standards and apparently genuinely preferred. Tiberius, who was by nature austere, probably ate little at night if at all. There are accounts of him being frugal with food throughout his life, the soldier's simplicity rather than philosophical principle, though the result was similar. Caligula, as we discussed, ate at night in ways the sources find scandalous, richly, elaborately, at inappropriate hours, demanding the kitchen produce things that required waking people, and activating the full apparatus of imperial catering in the deep watches of the night. Whether this is literally accurate, or a literary amplification of the bad emperor eats badly motif is hard to determine. Nero ate with the extravagance that characterized his approach to most things. The kitchen in Nero's time was itself an expression of imperial ambition. He had access to the most skilled culinary staff in the empire, to ingredients brought from every corner of the Roman world, and he had the kind of enthusiastic, interested relationship with food that the sources describe without any apparent moral condemnation, which suggests it was not in itself considered a vice, but simply a pleasure he took seriously. Marcus Aurelius ate simply and deliberately, managing his intake with the same careful attention he brought to managing everything else. The light meals before sleep, the avoidance of inflammatory foods, the regular schedule, These were part of the same philosophical project as the meditations themselves. There is a document called Apicius, which is the oldest surviving Latin cookbook, though it is not a single document, but a compilation assembled in the late antique period from materials of varying date. It gives us our most direct access to what Roman food actually was, the recipes, the ingredients, the techniques, the extraordinary complexity of the Roman taste for layered, multivalent flavors that combined sweet and sour and savory, and bitter in single dishes in ways that modern Western cooking generally avoids. The Romans used a condiment called garum, which was a fermented fish sauce produced from the slow anaerobic breakdown of fish and salt in large sealed containers. That was as fundamental to Roman cooking as soy sauce is to Japanese cooking or fish sauce is to Thai cooking. It was everywhere in almost everything, and it provided a deep, savory, slightly marine flavor base that is difficult to fully reproduce without the same fermentation process. They used honey extensively, not just in sweet dishes but in savory ones, as a flavor component and as a preservative. They used vinegar. They used an enormous range of dried spices brought from the eastern trade routes: pepper, cinnamon, cumin, coriander, asafoetida, called silphium in the sources, though the specific plant may have gone extinct in antiquity from overharvesting. They used wine in cooking in the way we use stock. The result of all this was a flavor profile quite unlike either the modern Italian cooking that occupies the geographical and cultural space of Roman cuisine, or the stereotype of Roman food that involves gladiators eating dormice. The dormice were real, small, fattened dormice stuffed with pork and pine nuts, or a genuine Roman delicacy described in Apicius, but they were a specific luxury item, not a dietary staple. The staple of Roman diet was bread and grain in various forms, plus olive oil, wine, and whatever vegetable matter was available seasonally. A midnight snack from the imperial kitchen in the third watch might be a small plate of bread with oil and perhaps a mild sheep's cheese, olives, dried fruit, a small clay cup of wine mixed with water and perhaps a little honey. Something warm in winter, a small bowl of what we might call soup, broth based with lentils or chickpeas, seasoned simply. Something cold in summer, sliced fruit, chilled in the cellar where amphorae of wine and water were kept at consistent cool temperatures by the depth of the storage. These are humble pleasures. The pleasures of waking in the night and being briefly, comfortably hungry and knowing that the kitchen is there and warm and that something simple and good can be had. The emperor experiencing this pleasure is in this moment entirely human, entirely ordinary. Standing in his sleeping clothes in the lamplight of the kitchen passage, eating a fig, listening to the fire. The last watch, it is the fourth watch now. In our story in the Roman division of the night, we have moved through the first watch, the early evening, the winding down, the second watch, the proper sleep, the deep unconsciousness, the third watch, the midnight interval, the time of rituals and waking, and we have arrived at the fourth, the pre-dawn, the time between the deepest part of the night and the first grey light in the east. The fourth watch had its own character. It was when the watcher's attention was most tested. In a military context, the fourth watch was considered the most dangerous post because it was the hour when the body's need for sleep was most insistent and the vigilance most difficult to maintain. Soldiers on night watch in the fourth watch were paid extra or rotated more frequently than those in other watches, because falling asleep on post at the fourth watch was more likely than at any other hour. For the emperors who kept unusual hours, the fourth watch was a liminal space. Not quite night anymore, not yet morning, a time of transition in which the particular quality of darkness began, almost imperceptibly, to change. The lamps burned lower as their oil ran low and was not replenished. The fire in the brazier cooled to embers. The ambient temperature of a Roman room, even a well-insulated one, dropped toward its lowest point of the night, the chill before dawn that is a feature of even Mediterranean climates. This was the hour when the emperor who had been reading or writing or walking set down his book or his pen and lay down again. The hour when the philosopher who had been working through his night thoughts in the margins of his private journal closed the cover and let the work rest. The hour when the musician who had been playing softly in the lamplight set down the instrument and let the silence hold the last note. The hour when the night agreed to end. Augustus, in the fourth watch, would have been in the deeper part of his second sleep, the segmented sleep pattern restored after the waking interval, his breathing slow, and even the household around him maintaining its careful quiet. His reader would have been asleep in the anteroom, the scroll beside him, ready if needed but no longer needed tonight. Tiberius, on his cliff above the Capri Sea, would have been watching the sky change. The eastward-facing observation platform of the Villa Jovis commands a view of the horizon over the Bay of Naples, and the first suggestion of dawn, the almost imperceptible lightening of the sky's eastern edge, long before any color appears, is visible from that platform. He would have watched for it. Would have found it, even in his documented melancholy, a kind of comfort. The night has not gone on forever. The sky is still doing what it is supposed to do. Marcus Aurelius, in his tent on the Danube, would have been arguing himself out of bed. Come, if there is anything to be done, let us be about it. the philosopher preparing to be the emperor again, the private inner life folding itself back into the professional public one as the fourth watch moved toward dawn. Nero, in the lamplight of the Domus Aurea, would have been setting down the lyre. The last note would have faded into the painted ceilings. The gold walls would have held their color even in the dying lamplight. He would have been, in this moment, simply a tired young man at the end of a long night, with the very beginning of the day's obligations already pressing at the edge of consciousness. The night they shared with us, there is a thread that runs through all of these men and all of their nights, and it is simply this: they were awake. In all the ways that the powerful and the isolated and the overworked and the intelligent and the frightened and the grieving are awake. In the specific, universal way that the dark hours extract from everyone who lies in them, the particular quality of consciousness that comes at 2 or 3 in the morning, when the day's distractions are gone and the night's silence has removed every external thing, and what is left is simply the self, alone with whatever it carries. They carried different things. Augustus carried the accumulated anxiety of having built something enormous and fragile and not knowing if it would survive. Tiberius carried grief and suspicion and the weight of a role he had never wanted. Marcus carried the pressure of an empire at war against a body that was slowly failing him, and the long, continuous work of trying to be better than he naturally was. Nero carried the music, and the longing for the life where music was enough, and the knowledge that it was not. These men lived in circumstances so remote from our own that the distance seems at first unbridgeable. The marble rooms, the slave attendants. The absolute power, the empire stretching from Scotland to Syria, from the Rhine to the Sahara, all of it dependent on decisions made by one person in rooms we can no longer enter. But the sleeplessness is familiar. The pre-dawn quiet is familiar. The experience of lying in the dark with one's own thoughts, with the day's unfinished business and tomorrow's anticipated difficulties, and the persistent, low-level hum of everything that is not resolved, that is not remote at all. That is as close as the next few hours. They were not better or worse than us at this. They were earlier than us. They lay in their darkness with different gods and different medical theories and different political structures around them, but in the fundamental experience of being a conscious mind in a sleeping world, they were simply and irreducibly human. The same human thing that lies awake in every room tonight, in every city, in every corner of the world that has inherited something from the Roman world, which is to say, most of the world. Augustus's lamp has gone out. Tiberius's cliff is dark above the water. The meditations are closed. The tent is quiet. The Danube moves in its ancient channel in the dark. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House, is underground now, beneath later construction, beneath the baths of Trajan that Trajan built over it deliberately, clearing away the embarrassing enormity of Nero's personal palace to restore the land to the public. You can visit the Domus Aurea today, the excavated portions of it, guided by modern lights through rooms that still have their frescoes, rooms where the paint is still on the walls after 2,000 years. The garden is gone. The lake is gone, replaced by the Colosseum. The revolving ceiling is gone. The gold is gone, but the rooms are still there in the dark under the city. And in certain rooms, if you let your imagination work the way it wants to work, you can almost hear it, the distant sound of a lyre playing very softly in a room lit by a single lamp. We are approaching the end of our night together, and it is worth saying gently what this whole long story has been about. Not battles, not betrayals. Not the political machinations that fill the conventional history books. This has been about the hours that history usually skips over. The hours between the last official act of the day and the first official act of the next day. The hours that belong to no public record and no ceremonial occasion and no performance of power. The private hours, the dark hours. In those hours, the men who held the most power the Western world had ever seen were simply men. Men with cold feet in winter and bodies that ached and minds that would not quiet themselves and lamps that burned down toward nothing, and the specific, familiar loneliness of the person who is awake when the world is asleep. They read, they wrote, they walked, they played music. They bathed in warm water and lay on beds that were smaller than their days required. They listened to the sound of the city and the sea and the camp and the river. They dreamed and they tried to understand their dreams. They thought about death, which is the great night thought, the one that the dark hours bring most reliably to every person who has ever lain in them. And then, as the fourth watch moved toward dawn, they slept, or they gave up on sleep and rose to meet the day. Or they lay in that gentle territory between sleep and waking, neither in the day nor quite in the night, suspended in the particular peace that comes to the exhausted mind when it finally lets go. The fourth watch moved toward dawn. Rome was still there. The lamp burned down. Sleep well.